Father Bright felt as though he had been walking a tightrope for hours. Laird and Lady Duncan had been talking in low, controlled voices that betrayed an inner nervousness, but Father Bright realized that he and the Countess had been doing the same thing. The Duncan of Duncan had offered his condolences on the death of the late Count, with the proper air of suppressed sorrow, as had Mary, Lady Duncan. The Countess had accepted them solemnly and with gratitude, but Father Bright was well aware that no one in the room, possibly, he thought, no one in the world, regretted the Count's passing. Laird Duncan sat in his wheelchair, his sharp Scots features set in a sad smile that showed an intent to be affable, even though great sorrow weighed heavily upon him. Father Bright noticed it and realized that his own face had the same sort of expression. No one was fooling anyone else, of that the priest was certain, but for anyone to admit it would be the most boorish breach of etiquette. But there was a haggardness, a look of increased age about the laird's countenance that Father Bright did not like. His priestly intuition told him clearly that there was a turmoil of emotion in the Scotsman's mind that was, well, evil was the only word for it. Lady Duncan was, for the most part, silent. In the past 15 minutes, since she and her husband had come to the informal tea, she had spoken scarcely a dozen words. Her face was mask-like, but there was the same look of haggardness about her eyes as there was in her husband's face. But the priest's emphatic sense told him that the emotion here was fear, simple and direct. His keen eyes had noticed that she wore a shade too much makeup. She had almost succeeded in covering up the faint bruise on her right cheek, but not completely. My lady the Countess Devereux was all sadness and unhappiness, but there was neither fear nor evil there. She smiled politely and talked quietly. Father Bright would have been willing to bet that not one of the 4 of them would remember a word that had been spoken. Father Bright had placed his chair so that he could keep an eye on the open doorway and the long hall that led in from the great keep. He hoped Lord Darcy would hurry. Neither of the guests had been told that the Duke's investigator was here, and Father Bright was just a little apprehensive about the meeting. The Duncans had not even been told that the Count's death had been murder, but he was certain that they knew. Father Bright saw Lord Darcy come in through the door at the far end of the hall. He murmured a polite excuse and rose. The other 3 accepted his excuses with the same politeness and went on with their talk. Father Bright met Lord Darcy in the hall. "Did you find what you were looking for, Lord Darcy?" the priest asked in a low tone. "Yes," Lord Darcy said. "I'm afraid we shall have to arrest Laird Duncan." "Murder?" "Perhaps. I'm not yet certain of that. But the charge will be black magic. He has all the paraphernalia in a chest in his room. Master Sean reports that a ritual was enacted in the bedroom last night. Of course, that's out of my jurisdiction. You, as a representative of the church, will have to be the arresting officer." He paused. "You don't seem surprised, Reverence." "I'm not," Father Bright admitted. "I felt it. You and Master Sean will have to make out a sworn deposition before I can act." "I understand. Can you do me a favor?" "If I can." "Get my lady the Countess out of the room on some pretext or other. Leave me alone with her guests. I do not wish to upset my lady any more than absolutely necessary." "I think I can do that. Shall we go in together?" "Why not? But don't mention why I am here. Let them assume I'm just another guest." "Very well." All 3 occupants of the room glanced up as Father Bright came in with Lord Darcy. The introductions were made. Lord Darcy humbly begged the pardon of his hostess for his lateness. Father Bright noticed the same sad smile on Lord Darcy's handsome face as the others were wearing. Lord Darcy helped himself from the buffet table and allowed the Countess to pour him a large cup of hot tea. He mentioned nothing about the recent death. Instead, he turned the conversation toward the wild beauty of Scotland and the excellence of the grouse shooting there. Father Bright had not sat down again. Instead, he left the room once more. When he returned, he went directly to the Countess and said in a low but clearly audible voice, "My lady, Sir Pierre Morlaix has informed me that there are a few matters that require your attention immediately. It will require only a few moments." My lady the Countess did not hesitate, but made her excuses immediately. "Do finish your tea," she added. "I don't think I shall be long." Lord Darcy knew the priest would not lie, and he wondered what sort of arrangement had been made with Sir Pierre. Not that it mattered, except that Lord Darcy had hoped it would be sufficiently involved for it to keep the Countess busy for at least 10 minutes. The conversation, interrupted but momentarily, returned to grouse. "I haven't done any shooting since my accident," said Laird Duncan, "but I used to enjoy it immensely. I still have friends up every year for the season." "What sort of weapon do you prefer for grouse?" Lord Darcy asked. "A 1-inch bore with a modified choke," said the Scot. "I have a pair that are favour. Excellent weapons." "Of Scottish make?" No, English. Your London gunsmiths can't be beat for shotguns." "Oh, I thought perhaps your lordship had had all your guns made in Scotland." As he spoke, he took the little pistol out of his coat pocket and put it carefully on the table. There was a sudden silence. Then Laird Duncan said in an angry voice, "What is this? Where did you get that?" Lord Darcy glanced at Lady Duncan, who had turned suddenly pale. "Perhaps," he said coolly, "Lady Duncan can tell us." She shook her head and gasped. For a moment she had trouble in forming words or finding her voice. Finally, No, I know nothing. But Laird Duncan looked at her oddly. "You do not deny that it is your gun, my lord?" Lord Darcy asked. "Or your wife's, as the case may be." "Where did you get it?" There was a dangerous quality in the Scotsman's voice. He had once been a powerful man, and Lord Darcy could see his shoulder muscles bunching. "From the late Count Devereux's bedroom." "What was it doing there?" There was a snarl in the Scot's voice, but Lord Darcy had the feeling that the question was as much directed toward Lady Duncan as it was to himself. "One of the things it was doing there was shooting Count Devereux through the heart." Lady Duncan slumped forward in a dead faint, overturning her teacup. Laird Duncan made a grab at the gun, ignoring his wife. Lord Darcy's hand sneaked out and picked up the weapon before the Scot could touch it. No, my lord," he said mildly. "This is evidence in a murder case. We mustn't tamper with the king's evidence." He wasn't prepared for what happened next. Laird Duncan roared something obscene in Scots Gaelic, put his hands on the arms of his wheelchair, and, with a great thrust of his powerful arms and shoulders, shoved himself up and forward toward Lord Darcy, across the table from him. His arms swung up toward Lord Darcy's throat as the momentum of his body carried him toward the investigator. He might have made it, but the weakness of his legs betrayed him. His waist struck the edge of the massive oaken table, and most of his forward momentum was lost. He collapsed forward, his hands still grasping toward the surprised Englishman. His chin came down hard on the tabletop. Then he slid back, taking the tablecloth and the china and silverware with him. He lay unmoving on the floor. His wife did not even stir, except when the tablecloth tugged at her head. Lord Darcy had jumped back, overturning his chair. He stood on his feet, looking at the two unconscious forms. "I don't think there's any permanent damage done to either," said Dr. Pately an hour later. "Lady Duncan was suffering from shock, of course, but Father Bright brought her round in a hurry. She's a devout woman, I think, even if a sinful one." "What about Laird Duncan?" Lord Darcy asked. "Well, that's a different matter. I'm afraid that his back injury was aggravated, and that crack on the chin didn't do him any good. I don't know whether Father Bright can help him or not. Healing takes the cooperation of the patient. I did all I could for him, but I'm just a chirurgeon, not a practitioner of the healing art. Father Bright has quite a good reputation in that line, however, and he may be able to do his lordship some good." Master Sean shook his head dolefully. "His reverence has the talent, there's no doubt of that. But now he's pitted against another man who has it, a man whose mind is bent on self-destruction in the long run." "Well, that's none of my affair," said Dr. Pately. "I'm just a technician. I'll leave healing up to the church where it belongs." "Master Sean," said Lord Darcy, "there is still a mystery here. We need more evidence. What about the eyes?" Master Sean blinked. "You mean the picture test, my lord?" "I do." "It won't stand up in court, my lord," said the sorcerer. "I'm aware of that," said Lord Darcy testily. "Eye test?" Dr. Pately asked blankly. "I don't believe I understand." "It's not often used," said Master Sean. "It is a psychic phenomenon that sometimes occurs at the moment of death, especially a violent death. The violent emotional stress causes a sort of a backfiring of the mind, if you see what I mean. As a result, the image in the mind of the dying person is returned to the retina. By using the proper sorcery, this image can be developed, and the last thing the dead man saw can be brought out. But it's a difficult process, even under the best of circumstances, and usually the conditions aren't right. In the first place, it doesn't always occur. It never occurs, for instance, when the person is expecting the attack. A man who is killed in a duel, or who is shot after facing the gun for several seconds, has time to adjust to the situation. Also, death must occur almost instantly. If he lingers even for a few minutes, the effect is lost. And naturally, if the person's eyes are closed at the instant of death, nothing shows up." "Count Devereux's eyes were open," Dr. Pately said. "They were still open when we found him. How long after death does the image remain?" "Until the cells of the retina die and lose their identity. Rarely more than 24 hours, usually much less." "It hasn't been 24 hours yet," said Lord Darcy, "and there is a chance that the Count was taken completely by surprise." "I must admit, my lord," Master Sean said thoughtfully, "that the conditions seem favourable. I shall attempt it, but don't put any hopes on it, my lord." "I shan't. Just do your best, Master Sean. If there is a sorcerer in practice who can do the job, it is you." "Thank you, my lord. I'll get busy on it right away," said the sorcerer with a subdued glow of pride. 2 hours later, Lord Darcy was striding down the corridor of the great hall, Master Sean following up as best he could, his curthane wood staff in one hand and his big carpet bag in the other. He had asked Father Bright and the Countess Devereux to meet him in one of the smaller guest rooms, but the Countess came to meet him. "My Lord Darcy," she said, her plain face looking worried and unhappy. "Is it true that you suspect Laird and Lady Duncan of this murder? Because if so, I must—"
"No longer, my lady."
Lord Darcy cut her off quickly.
"I think we can show that neither is guilty of murder, although of course the black magic charge must still be held against Laird Duncan."
"I understand," she said, "but—"
"Please, my lady."
Lord Darcy interrupted again.
"Let me explain everything. Come."
Without another word, she turned and led the way to the room where Father Bright was waiting. The priest stood waiting, his face showing tenseness.
"Please," said Lord Darcy, "sit down, both of you. This won't take long. My lady, may Master Sean make use of that table over there?"
"Certainly, my lord," the Countess said softly. "Certainly."
"Thank you, my lady. Please sit down. This won't take long. Please."
With apparent reluctance, Father Bright and my lady the Countess sat down in 2 chairs facing Lord Darcy. They paid little attention to what Master Sean O'Loughlin was doing. Their eyes were on Lord Darcy.
"Conducting an investigation of this sort is not an easy thing," he began carefully. "Most murder cases could be easily solved by your chief man-at-arms. We find that well-trained county police, in by far the majority of cases, can solve the mystery easily, and in most cases there's very little mystery. But, by His Imperial Majesty's law, the chief man-at-arms must call in a duke's investigator if the crime is insoluble, or if it involves a member of the aristocracy. For that reason, you were perfectly correct to call His Highness the Duke as soon as murder had been discovered." He leaned back in his chair. "And it has been clear from the first that my lord the late Count was murdered."
Father Bright started to say something, but Lord Darcy cut him off before he could speak.
"By murder, Reverend Father, I mean that he did not die a natural death, by disease or heart trouble or accident or what have you. I should perhaps use the word homicide. Now the question we have been called upon to answer is simply this: who was responsible for the homicide?"
The priest and the Countess remained silent, looking at Lord Darcy as though he were some sort of divinely inspired oracle.
"As you know, pardon me, my lady, if I am blunt, the late Count was something of a playboy. No, I will make that stronger. He was a satyr, a lecher. He was a man with a sexual obsession. For such a man, if he indulges in his passions, which the late Count most certainly did, there is usually but one end. Unless he is a man who has a winsome personality, which he did not, there will be someone who will hate him enough to kill him. Such a man inevitably leaves behind him a trail of wronged women and wronged men. One such person may kill him. One such person did. But we must find the person who did and determine the extent of his or her guilt. That is my purpose.